Imagine a vast, shimmering desert under the scorching sun of the American West, where two rugged miners walk into a prestigious San Francisco bank with a weather-beaten leather bag. When they upend the satchel onto a mahogany table, a literal mountain of uncut diamonds, rubies, and emeralds spills out, sparkling with a cold, hypnotic light. This was not a fairy tale. It was the beginning of the greatest financial deception in the history of the United States. A lie so perfectly crafted that it fooled the world's most powerful bankers, the smartest geologists, and even the founder of Tiffany & Co. Tonight, we step back into the year 1872 to uncover the silent, shifting sands of the Great Diamond Hoax. The air in San Francisco during the early 1870s was thick with the scent of salt from the Pacific and the heavy metallic tang of ambition. The city was a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of the Gilded Age, a place where wooden piers groaned under the weight of incoming ships, and the streets were paved with the dreams of men who had come west to find their fortunes. It was a time of transition. The frantic desperation of the 1849 gold rush had cooled into a more calculated era of corporate mining and high-stakes finance. Men in top hats and silk waistcoats now sat in velvet-lined offices, trading stocks in silver mines they had never seen, and betting entire empires on the word of a telegram. In this atmosphere of extreme wealth and even more extreme greed, the stage was set for two unassuming cousins to perform a feat of psychological magic that would leave the nation breathless. Philip Arnold and John Slack were not the kind of men you would notice in a crowded saloon. They were weathered, dusty, and carried the quiet, guarded expressions of men who had spent more time talking to mules than to people. Arnold, the older and more calculating of the two, had spent years wandering the territories of the West, learning the language of the earth, the way a certain tint in the soil might suggest copper, or how a specific curve in a creek bed could hide flakes of gold. He understood the desperate hunger of the rich men in the cities. He knew that while they held the capital, they lacked the grit and the practical knowledge of the wilderness. He knew that the most powerful tool in the world was not a shovel or a pickaxe, but an idea that seemed too good to be true, yet was presented with the dull, grim veneer of hard work. The deception began quietly, almost accidentally, at the counter of the Bank of California. It was late in the afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the high windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Arnold and Slack approached the plate with an air of nervous secrecy. They didn't ask for a loan. They didn't ask for a favor. They simply asked if they could deposit a small package in the bank's secure vault for safekeeping. They acted like men who were terrified of being followed, their eyes darting toward the heavy brass doors of the bank. When the package was opened in the presence of the bank's head, William Ralston, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Ralston was a man who moved the world with his signature, a titan of industry who controlled steamships, telegraph lines, and the very flow of currency in the West. But as he stared at the rough, glittering stones spilling out of the miner's bag, even he felt the ancient primal pull of the earth's hidden treasures. There were diamonds, hundreds of them, along with deep red rubies and shards of green emeralds. To the untrained eye of a city banker, they looked like a king's ransom pulled directly from a secret vein in the mountains. Arnold and Slack told a hesitant, rambling story of a diamond field they had stumbled upon in a remote corner of the desert, a place so far from civilization that the wind was the only witness to its riches. They spoke of picking the stones up from the surface of the ground like fallen fruit after a storm. They appeared reluctant to share any details, feigning a desire to simply go back to their quiet lives as simple miners. This was their masterstroke. By pretending they didn't want the fame or the investment, they made Ralston and his circle of wealthy associates desperate to give it to them. The news of the discovery didn't break like a thunderclap. It spreads like a slow, irresistible fever through the private clubs and smoking rooms of San Francisco. The prospect of a domestic diamond mine was more than just a financial opportunity. It was a matter of national pride. At the time, nearly all the world's diamonds came from South Africa or Brazil. If America had its own fields, it would shift the balance of global wealth. Ralston, smelling a legacy that would dwarf his previous achievements, quickly assembled a group of the most influential men in the country. He reached out to Baron von Rothschild in London and contacted Horace Greeley in New York. The machinery of the elite was grinding into motion, fueled by the glittering promise held in a dirty leather bag. But before millions of dollars could be moved, there had to be proof. Even in an age of speculation, a discovery of this magnitude required verification. Arnold and Slack, playing their roles to perfection, agreed to take a representative of the investors to the secret location. However, they insisted on conditions that would have seemed suspicious if the investors hadn't been so blinded by the sparkle of the gems. They insisted that the journey be made under a veil of total secrecy. The representative would be blindfolded for the final legs of the journey, ensuring that even if he saw the diamonds, he would never be able to find his way back to the spot without them. It was a classic long con tactic, using the victim's own imagination to fill in the blanks. As the small party left the fog-chilled air of San Francisco and headed east into the rugged, unforgiving interior of the continent, the true scale of the illusion began to take shape. They traveled by train, then by horseback, moving deeper into the high-altitude wilderness where the oxygen was thin and the horizon seemed to stretch on forever. Arnold and Slack guided them with an eerie confidence, leading the city-bred investors through labyrinths of red rock and sagebrush, always keeping the destination just over the next ridge. The silence of the desert was immense, a heavy blanket that muffled the sounds of the horses' hooves and the anxious breathing of the men. Every mile they traveled away from the safety of the city was a mile deeper into the web the cousins had spun. The landscape through which they moved was a cathedral of stone and silence, a place where time seemed to have stood still for eons. Philip Arnold and John Slack led the expedition with a calculated rhythm, ensuring the representatives felt the physical exhaustion of the trail, for an exhausted mind is least likely to question details. They crossed over jagged ridgelines and descended into arroyos that shimmered with heat haze, the dust of the high desert coating their clothes and parching their throats. To the city men, this was a foreign and hostile planet, but to Arnold it was a canvas. Every mile they traveled was a deliberate misdirection, a winding path designed to disorient and overwhelm. When they finally reached the designated spot, a remote plateau nestled in the shadow of the Uinta Mountains, the atmosphere was thick with a nervous, electric anticipation. Arnold stood at the edge of a nondescript patch of sandy soil, dotted with scrub brush and weather-worn rocks. He turned to the group, his face a mask of humble sincerity, and simply gestured to the ground at their feet. For a moment, There was nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the canyons. Then one of the men knelt down. With a trembling hand, he brushed away a layer of loose dirt, and there, wedged against a small pebble, was a flash of cold, clear light. It was a diamond. Shouts of disbelief and joy broke the desert silence. The men scrambled onto their hands and knees, digging frantically into the topsoil with their bare fingers and pocket knives. Within minutes, the plateau revealed a bounty that defied all geologic logic. They found rubies as red as pigeon's blood, sapphires the color of a midnight sky, and diamonds of varying sizes, all seemingly scattered just beneath the surface. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled a breath of pure wealth. Arnold and Slack stood back, watching the spectacle with the quiet satisfaction of men who had shared their secret. They didn't need to say a word. The investors were doing all the convincing for them. What the investors didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams, was that this discovery had been meticulously planned. Months earlier, Arnold and Slack had traveled to London and Amsterdam, using their initial savings to buy thousands of dollars worth of low-grade, industrial-quality uncut gems. They had literally salted the desert, pushing the stones into the dirt with the tips of their boots and the ends of their walking sticks. They had studied the terrain to find a spot that looked plausible enough to be a geological anomaly, yet remote enough that no one would stumble upon it by accident. They had created a stage, and now the most powerful men in America were dancing upon it. The party returned to San Francisco not as mere travelers, but as apostles of a new golden age. The gems they brought back were taken to the finest jewelers for appraisal. Even Charles Tiffany, the legendary founder of Tiffany & Co. in New York, was brought in to examine the stones. In a grand hotel suite, surrounded by the heavy scent of expensive cigars and the hushed tones of the elite, Tiffany held the rough stones up to the light. He was an expert in polished, finished jewelry, but the raw, uncut nature of these desert finds was outside his daily expertise. Swayed by the excitement of the men around him and the sheer volume of the hall, he pronounced them to be of vast value. His endorsement was the final seal of approval the hoax needed. If Tiffany said they were real, they were real. With the blessing of the Jewelry King, the financial floodgates opened. William Ralston and his associates formed the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, capitalized at a staggering $10 million, an astronomical sum in the 1870s. Shares were not even offered to the public. The founders wanted to keep the unimaginable wealth for themselves. They were the smart money, the titans of the era, and they believed they had pulled off the greatest acquisition in history. Arnold and Slack, meanwhile, played their hands with incredible restraint. They didn't ask for millions up front. They accepted a relatively modest payment of about $600,000 to relinquish their rights to the land, claiming they were tired of the stress and wanted to retire in peace. This move was the genius of the plan. By taking a smaller sum and disappearing into the background, they avoided the immediate scrutiny that a massive payout would have triggered. They let the greed of the bankers drive the momentum. As the company began to organize a massive mining operation, hiring engineers and planning railroads to the site, the two cousins began their quiet exit. Slack vanished into the shadows of the backcountry, while Arnold returned to his home in Kentucky, playing the role of a successful but humble man who had struck it lucky in the West. But while they rested, a storm was brewing in the world of science, a storm that would be triggered by a man who valued facts more than gold. Enter Clarence King, a young, brilliant, and fiercely dedicated geologist with the United States Geological Survey. King was a man of the outdoors, a scientist who had spent years mapping the 40th parallel. When he heard the rumors of a diamond field in the Rocky Mountains, he didn't feel excitement. He felt a deep, nagging skepticism. He knew the geology of the American West like the back of his hand, and he knew that diamonds, rubies, and sapphires simply did not form in the same types of rock. The presence of all three in one location was a geological impossibility. It was like finding a polar bear in the middle of the Sahara Desert. King wasn't motivated by money or fame. He was motivated by the integrity of the country he had spent his life studying. He feared that if a massive mining fraud was allowed to proceed, it would discredit the fledgling field of geology and destroy public trust in scientific surveys. Without authorization and with only a few trusted assistants, King set out to find the secret location. He had very few clues, only the vague descriptions of the terrain and the approximate travel times mentioned by the initial party. He was looking for a needle in a haystack of red rock and sagebrush, but he had one advantage. He knew what the earth was supposed to look like, and he knew how to spot a lie written in stone. The journey King undertook was a masterpiece of detective work. He analyzed the flora and fauna mentioned in the investors' reports, narrowed down the possible mountain ranges, and eventually tracked the trail to the remote plateau in the Uintas. When he arrived, the site looked exactly as described. He found the same diamond-bearing soil that had fooled Charles Tiffany and William Ralston. But King didn't just look at the surface, he looked at the context. He noticed that the gems were only found in disturbed soil, often in crevices of rocks where they would naturally collect if dropped, rather than where they would be found if they had formed naturally in the bedrock. He also found something the investors, in their blind greed, had completely overlooked. In a small, sheltered nook of the plateau, King discovered a stone that bore the unmistakable marks of a human tool, a diamond that had been partially cut by a lapidary wheel. Nature does not produce pre-cut diamonds. This was the smoking gun. The entire field had been salted, and not even with high-quality stones, but with the refuse of the London gem markets. The greatest discovery of the century was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated theatrical production. Clarence King stood on that lonely, wind-swept plateau in the Uintas, holding a small, chipped diamond that had clearly been touched by a jeweler's tool thousands of miles away in Europe. The realization hit him with the weight of a mountain. This wasn't just a mistake or a hopeful guess by the miners. It was a cold, calculated crime against the very soil of the United States. King knew that every hour he delayed, more shares were being traded, more reputations were being staked, and more innocent people, and perhaps even the government, were being drawn into a vortex of lies. He didn't have a telegraph in the wilderness, so he began a frantic, bone-weary journey back to civilization, riding through the night across treacherous terrain to reach the nearest station. When King finally reached a telegraph office, his message sent shockwaves through the financial corridors of San Francisco. He didn't just send a vague warning, he sent a detailed, scientific indictment. He contacted the board of the mining company directly, informing them that their diamond field was a fabrication. At first, there was a stunned, defensive silence. William Ralston and his associates had invested not just their money, but their egos into this venture. To admit that a young geologist had seen through a scam that they had missed was a bitter pill to swallow. They tried to downplay King's findings, suggesting he had perhaps visited the wrong location or that he was seeking fame for himself. But Clarence King was not a man who could be silenced by corporate bluster. He demanded a second official inspection, and this time he wouldn't be blindfolded. He returned to the site with a party that included the company's own experts. As they stood on the plateau, King pointed out the absurdities that the previous visitors had ignored in their rush for riches. He showed them how the diamonds were only found in the ant hills, small mounds of dirt where Arnold and Slack had literally poked holes and dropped the stones. He showed them that the rubies and diamonds, which in nature are never found in the same geological strata, were sitting side by side in the dust. The experts looked on in horror as the truth became undeniable. The mountain of gems was nothing more than a salted field of industrial waste.
The news broke in the San Francisco papers like a physical blow. The city, which had been buzzing with the promise of a new era of prosperity, suddenly went cold. The Great Diamond Hoax became the headline of every major newspaper from New York to London. The high society men who had bragged about their exclusive shares in the mine suddenly found themselves the laughingstock of the continent. William Ralston, the man who had built the Palace Hotel and dominated the banking world, saw his reputation shatter overnight. Although he personally paid back many of the investors to save his honor, the damage to his bank and his spirit was permanent. The king of the Comstock had been humbled by two men who probably couldn't even read a balance sheet. While the city was in an uproar, the search for the perpetrators began in earnest. But Philip Arnold and John Slack were gone. They had anticipated the collapse and had used their head start to perfection. John Slack, the quieter of the two, seemed to dissolve into the very air of the West. Some said he fled to Mexico. Others claimed he changed his name and lived out his days as a simple laborer in the boom towns of the Southwest, never spending a dime of his ill-gotten wealth for fear of being caught. He became a ghost, a shadow in the annals of American crime, leaving no trail for the private detectives who scoured the frontier for him. Philip Arnold, however, was a different breed of man. He didn't hide in the shadows, he went home. He returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, with a fortune that made him the wealthiest man in the county. To his neighbors, he wasn't a criminal. He was a local boy who had made it big in the Wild West and brought the spoils back to the South. When the law finally caught up with him, Arnold didn't flee. He hired the best lawyers in the state and prepared for a legal battle that would be fought in the courts of public opinion as much as in a courtroom. He maintained a stance of injured innocence, claiming that if the diamonds were fake, he was just as much a victim as the bankers, a simple miner who had been mistaken about his find. The legal proceedings that followed were a chaotic circus. The San Francisco investors tried to sue Arnold for the return of their $600,000, but they faced a significant problem. To win, they had to admit in open court exactly how they had been fooled. They had to describe their own greed and their own failure to perform due diligence. Furthermore, the jurisdiction was a nightmare. The crime had been planned in California, executed in the Wyoming territory, and the money was now sitting in a Kentucky bank. Arnold's lawyers played on the local prejudices of the time, painting the California bankers as greedy city slickers who were trying to bully a hard-working Kentucky farmer. In a strange twist of fate, Arnold eventually reached a settlement. He paid back a portion of the money, about $150,000, in exchange for the legal charges being dropped. It was a fraction of what he had taken, but for the bankers, it was a way to end the public humiliation and move on. Arnold spent the rest of his days in Kentucky, living in a grand house, operating a local bank, and even surviving an assassination attempt by a disgruntled business rival. He died not on the gallows or in a prison cell, but from a mundane case of pneumonia following a gunshot wound from a separate feud. He took the full story of the hoax to his grave, leaving behind a legacy of audacity that still echoes through history. The Great Diamond Hoax left a lasting mark on the American psyche. It served as a brutal wake-up call for the Gilded Age, a reminder that in a world of rapid expansion and easy credit, the line between a visionary investment and a total fabrication was dangerously thin. It also elevated the status of the U.S. Geological Survey and men like Clarence King. It proved that science was not just an academic pursuit, but a vital tool for protecting the nation's economy and its people. The desert plateau in the Juntas, once the site of such feverish dreams, returned to its natural state of silence, the wind eventually burying the last of the salted gems beneath the shifting sands. But the story doesn't end with the closing of the bank doors or the death of the protagonists. It lives on in the way we view the American West as a place of infinite possibility and infinite peril. It reminds us that the most successful lies are those that tell us exactly what we want to hear. The bankers wanted to believe in a mountain of diamonds because it fit their narrative of American exceptionalism and their own personal genius. They weren't just fooled by Arnold and Slack. They were fooled by their own reflection in the glittering surface of the stones.
The aftermath of the Great Diamond Hoax did not merely fade away into the dry desert air. It rippled through the very fabric of American society, exposing the raw nerves of a nation still recovering from the Civil War and exploding with industrial growth. To understand why such a grand deception worked and why it remains a haunting chapter of the West, one must look at the psychological landscape of the 1870s. This was an era where the impossible seemed to happen every Tuesday. The Transcontinental Railroad had just linked the Atlantic to the Pacific, shrinking a continent that once took months to cross into a journey of mere days. The telegraph allowed thoughts to travel at the speed of light. In such a world, why wouldn't there be a mountain of diamonds hidden in the vast, unmapped wilderness of the Rockies? The investors in San Francisco and New York weren't just greedy, they were victims of a specific kind of American optimism. They believed that the continent was a vast, unlocked treasure chest, and they were the rightful owners of the key. This belief created a blind spot the size of a mountain range. When Philip Arnold and John Slack presented their discovery, they weren't just selling stones, they were selling a confirmation of the American dream. The fallout from the hoax forced a radical shift in how the country viewed its own resources. No longer could a man's word and a bag of rocks be enough to move millions of dollars. The era of the gentleman's agreement in mining was dying, replaced by the cold, hard necessity of scientific verification. In the wake of the scandal, the United States government realized that the wild, untamed territories needed more than just soldiers and lawmen. They needed surveyors and scientists. The prestige that Clarence King earned by debunking the hoax directly contributed to the formal strengthening of the U.S. Geological Survey. It became a gatekeeper of truth, a barrier against the speculators and silver-tongued devils who sought to turn the public's imagination into a private bank account. The story of the hoax became a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of Harvard and Yale and debated in the smoky back rooms of Wall Street. It taught a generation of financiers that nature has its own laws, and those laws cannot be subverted by even the most convincing theater. But what of the stones themselves? The thousands of low-grade diamonds and rubies that Arnold and Slack had purchased in London didn't just disappear. For years after the hoax was revealed, local hunters, shepherds, and curious travelers would occasionally find a stray spark in the dirt of the Uinta Mountains. These leftovers of the fraud became a strange kind of local folklore. People would spend their Sundays sifting through the sand, hoping that the swindlers had missed a particularly large gem. It turned the site into a monument of irony, a place where people hunted for treasure that they knew was only there because someone else had put it there to rob them. It was a physical manifestation of the sunken cost fallacy, where the lure of the find outweighed the reality of the lie. The cultural impact extends to literature and the arts as well. The figure of the confidence man, the charming rogue who uses the victim's own desires against them, became a staple of American storytelling. Mark Twain, who was living and writing during this period, often captured this spirit of the age. The Diamond Hoax was the ultimate tall tale come to life, a narrative so audacious that it felt like it belonged in a book rather than a newspaper. It highlighted the thin line between the pioneer and the predator. Both required the same traits: courage, a willingness to endure hardship, and an intimate knowledge of the land. The only difference was the intent. Arnold and Slack were, in a dark sense, the ultimate pioneers of the psychological frontier. As the 19th century began to close, the memory of the hoax began to take on a softer, more nostalgic glow. The anger of the defrauded bankers was replaced by a grudging respect for the sheer scale of the trick. In the saloons of San Francisco, men would tell the story not as a tragedy, but as a classic David versus Goliath tale. Except in this version, David was a dusty miner with a bag of fake rocks, and Goliath was a group of arrogant millionaires. It spoke to a deeply rooted American skepticism of the elite. There was a secret, unspoken satisfaction in the idea that two men from the backwoods could outsmart the kings of the world, using nothing but a few handfuls of industrial waste and a blindfold. Even Philip Arnold's life in Kentucky after the event became a study in contradiction. He was a man who had built his house on a foundation of lies, yet he lived out his days as a pillar of his community. This duality is perhaps the most Gilded Age aspect of the entire story. It was an era of beautiful facades covering up grim realities. Arnold's mansion in Elizabethtown was his own personal diamond, polished and impressive on the outside, but acquired through methods that would not bear the light of day. He remained a man of mystery, rarely speaking of the West, as if the desert heat had seared the memories out of him, or perhaps he simply understood that the best way to keep a secret was to let it become a legend. The silence of the Uinta Mountains today gives no hint of the fever that once gripped the nation. The winds still howl through the canyons, and the red dust still swirls over the plateaus, burying the footsteps of both the swindlers and the scientists. But the lesson of the Great Diamond Hoax remains embedded in the soil of the American experience. It is a reminder that the greatest treasures are often the ones we are most desperate to see, and that the human heart, when faced with the glitter of sudden wealth, is the easiest terrain to salt. The story serves as a permanent anchor in the history of the West, a warning that while the earth may hide riches, it is the mind of man that creates the illusion of their value. The transition from the glittering mirage of the diamond fields to the dark, sodden forests of the Pacific Northwest felt as though the continent itself was shifting its mood. While Philip Arnold was counting his gold in Kentucky, another mystery was beginning to take shape in the shadows of the towering Douglas firs. A mystery not of greed and gems, but of disappearance and the strange, haunting echoes of a lost colony in the woods. This was the era of the Oregon Mist, a time when the boundary between the civilized world and the primordial wilderness was as thin as a veil. As the railroads pushed further into the steam-green heart of the Cascades, they began to encounter stories that didn't fit into the ledgers of the timber barons or the reports of the army. In the late autumn of 1874, a small group of surveyors working for the Northern Pacific Railway were marking a path through a valley that had no name on any official map. The air was perpetually cold, thick with a fog that seemed to swallow the sound of their axes. They were seasoned men, hardened by years of living in the elements, yet they felt an unnatural stillness in this particular stretch of timber. There were no bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the ferns. It was as if the forest were holding its breath. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, they stumbled upon a clearing that shouldn't have been there. In the center stood a circle of cabins, constructed with a precision that surpassed the rough shelters of typical pioneers. But there was no smoke rising from the chimneys. There were no dogs barking to greet the strangers. When the surveyors entered the first cabin, they found a scene that would haunt their dreams for years to come. A table was set for a meal. Plates of dried venison and hardtack sat untouched, covered in a fine layer of dust. A child's wooden horse lay on the floor near a cold hearth. It looked as though an entire community had simply stood up and walked into the trees in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, leaving everything behind. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks of fire, and no graves. Just the empty, hollow shells of lives interrupted. This discovery, which came to be known as the Hollow Settlement, sent a different kind of shiver through the American public. It's the Diamond Hoax was a story of how men could be fooled by what they saw. This was a story of the terror of what they could not see. The authorities in the Washington Territory were baffled. There were no records of a land claim in that valley, no census data suggesting a colony had been established. It was as if a piece of another time or place had been grafted onto the Oregon wilderness and then abandoned. The mystery of the Hollow Settlement became a whisper in the ears of every pioneer who ventured too far from the established trails, a reminder that the West was not just a map to be filled, but a vast, ancient entity that could swallow people whole. As the 1870s progressed, these stories of the unseen West began to compete with the loud, brash tales of outlaws and gold strikes. People started to realize that the frontier was not just a horizontal line moving toward the sunset. It was a vertical descent into the unknown. In the coastal towns of the Northwest, sailors told of ghost ships found drifting in the Salish Sea, their decks scrubbed clean and their galleys full of food, but not a soul on board. In the desert Southwest, shepherds spoke of the City of the Sun, a shimmering metropolis that appeared in the heat haze of the Mojave, only to disappear when approached. These were the glitch in the reality stories of the 19th century, the historical anomalies that modern science still struggles to explain. The fascination with these mysteries was partly a reaction to the extreme rationalism of the age. As men like Clarence King used geology to debunk frauds, the human spirit seemed to crave something that could not be debunked.
This gave rise to the great era of American spiritualism, where even the most practical people attended seances to speak with the dead. The boring history of this period is often found in the quiet, mundane details of these spiritualist camps. Thousands of people sitting in darkened tents in the middle of Kansas or Ohio, waiting for a bell to ring or a table to tilt. It was a nation trying to reconcile the cold reality of the Industrial Revolution with the unshakable feeling that there was something more lurking in the shadows of the New World. In the midst of this cultural tension, a man named Thomas Cahoe emerged in the historical record. Cahoe was a remittance man, a younger son of a wealthy English family sent to America with a monthly allowance to keep him out of trouble. He settled in the high plains of Nebraska, where he became obsessed with the singing sands, dunes that emitted a low, hummed vibration when the wind hit them at a certain angle. Cahoe spent 3 years living in a sod house, recording these sounds in a series of leather-bound journals. He believed the sands were a giant natural phonograph, recording the history of the earth in a language we had forgotten how to hear. His life was a slow, quiet descent into a very specific kind of madness, a history of a man who listened too closely to the silence. Cahoe's journals, which were found after his death in 1879, contain some of the most beautiful and haunting descriptions of the American landscape ever written. He didn't write about politics or wars. He wrote about the way the moonlight looked on the tall grass prairie and how the frost formed patterns on his window that looked like the maps of lost empires. To a modern listener, Cahoe's story is a sleep story in its purest form, a narrative of a man who withdrew from the noise of the world to find a deeper, more rhythmic peace in the heart of the continent. His life serves as a bridge between the frantic greed of the diamond hoax and the profound, lonely beauty of the American interior. The search for answers regarding the Hollow settlement didn't lead to a resolution, but rather to a deeper understanding of the isolation that defined the American frontier in the late 19th century. In 1876, a group of investigators from the territorial capital finally reached the valley, guided by the original surveyor's maps. They expected to find the cabins decayed or perhaps reclaimed by the forest, but instead they found that the silence had grown even heavier. Upon closer inspection of the logs used to build the cabins, they noticed something peculiar. The wood hadn't been cut with standard steel saws of the era. The grain was smooth, almost fused, as if the timber had been severed by an intense, focused heat. There were no tracks in the mud, no rusted tools left in the furrows of the small garden plots, and, most tellingly, no records of any wagon trains missing a group of that size. It was as if these people had materialized in the forest, lived a life of quiet perfection for a few seasons, and then vanished back into the ether. The lead investigator, a man named Silas Vance, wrote in his final report that some places on this continent simply do not wish to be known. He recommended that the valley be bypassed by the railroad, and for reasons never fully explained in the company archives, the Northern Pacific Railway did exactly that, curving their tracks miles away at a massive additional expense. The Hollow settlement was left to the moss and the mist, a ghost story written in cedar and hemlock.
As the decade turned toward the 1880s, the mystery of the Northwest found a strange parallel in the growing obsession with the deep sea. This was the era of the Great Descents, where the American public became fascinated by what lay beneath the waves of the Atlantic. While the West was being mapped and fenced, the ocean remained a vast, dark frontier that defied the logic of the Gilded Age. In 1882, the USS Albatross was commissioned, the first vessel built specifically for marine research. The ship was a floating laboratory, a marvel of brass, steam, and glass designed to peer into the abyssal plain. The stories that came back from the crew were as strange as any diamond hoax or lost colony. They spoke of phosphorescent storms beneath the surface, where the water would glow with a rhythmic, pulsing light for miles in every direction. They brought up creatures that seemed to be made of lace and nightmares, fish with translucent skin and eyes that glowed like small, cold lanterns. To the people of the 1880s, these discoveries were a profound shock. It suggested that even as they built their steel skyscrapers and lit their cities with Edison's new bulbs, they were living on a thin crust of reality, suspended between a mysterious sky and an even more mysterious sea. The boring history of these expeditions is found in the meticulous logs of the scientists who spent months counting the scales on a single specimen, trying to categorize a world that seemed to have no categories. This period also saw the rise of the great American recluse. As the world became more connected by wires and rails, a certain type of person felt the urge to go in the opposite direction. One such figure was Eloin Vance, a distant relative of the investigator Silas Vance. Eloin was a brilliant mathematician who, in 1884, left a comfortable life in Philadelphia to move to a remote lighthouse on the coast of Maine. She didn't move there to guide ships, she moved there to study the tide. For 15 years, she never spoke to a human soul, receiving her supplies via a small boat that left crates on a rocky ledge. When she finally passed away, her journals revealed a mind that had moved beyond the mundane concerns of the 19th century. She had recorded the timing of every wave that hit the rocks for over a decade. She claimed that the ocean was not a chaotic mass of water, but a complex mathematical machine that was slowly calculating the future of the planet. She wrote about the long waves, patterns that only repeated once every 7 years, and how they corresponded to the movements of the stars. Her life was a masterpiece of focused, quiet observation, a silent protest against the loud industrial roar of the era. Eloin's lighthouse still stands, a lonely sentinel on the edge of the Atlantic, holding the secrets of a woman who chose the rhythm of the sea over the rhythm of the clock. The 1880s were also the years of the great weather anomalies. In 1886, a phenomenon known as the silent winter struck the Great Plains. It wasn't just the cold, which was brutal enough to freeze cattle where they stood. It was the atmosphere. For 3 months, according to journals from the time, the wind completely stopped. The sky remained a flat metallic gray, and the snow fell in perfectly vertical lines, piling up in drifts that showed no ripples or curves. The silence was so absolute that people claimed they could hear the sound of their own heartbeats while standing in the middle of a field. It was a time of deep introspection, as families huddled around coal stoves, listening to the lack of sound. This silent winter changed the American character. It broke the back of the great cattle empires and forced the pioneers to realize that they were guests on this land, not its masters. It taught them the value of patience and the necessity of community. When the thaw finally came in the spring of 1887, it wasn't a joyous event, but a solemn one, as the receding snow revealed the true cost of the season. But in that hardship, a new kind of resilience was born, a quiet, steady strength that would define the rural heartland for generations to come. It was a history written in frost and endurance, far removed from the headlines of the New York papers. By the late 1880s, the map of the United States was largely filled in, but the interior map, the understanding of the American soul, was still being drafted. The stories of the Diamond Hoax, the Hollow Settlement, and the Silent Winter weren't just events, they were the layers of a national identity. They represented the tension between the desire to conquer and the need to wonder. As the lights of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago began to shimmer on the horizon, promising a future of electricity and order, the ghosts of the old, mysterious West continued to linger in the tall grass and the deep woods, reminding the world that some secrets are never meant to be solved. The 1890s arrived with a shimmer of electricity and the towering promise of the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Yet away from the glowing white city, the American landscape held on to pockets of the past that refused to modernize. This was the era of the hidden cities, small, isolated pockets of civilization that had developed in total isolation, often founded by groups who sought to escape the relentless march of the industrial age. In the high, arid plateaus of northern Arizona, rumors began to circulate among the mail carriers and circuit-riding preachers of a place called Opaline. It was said to be a city built entirely within the walls of a canyon, accessible only by a series of hidden handholds and ancient rope bridges that spanned dizzying chasms. Unlike the Diamond Hoax, which was built on a lie, Opaline was a reality built on a secret. When a government surveyor named Julian Thorne stumbled upon the entrance in 1891, he didn't find gold or gems. He found a community of 300 people living in houses carved directly into the sandstone cliffs, cooled by an intricate system of gravity-fed water channels. The people of Opaline were the descendants of a group of scholars and craftsmen who had fled the social upheavals of the 1840s. They had spent 50 years perfecting a lifestyle of quiet intellectual pursuit, far removed from the news of the Civil War or the invention of the telephone. Thorne's journals describe a place of extraordinary stillness, where the only sounds were the soft splashing of water and the turning of pages in their vast rock-walled library. Thorne stayed in Opaline for 3 weeks, and his accounts of their solar calendars, massive discs of polished copper that tracked the movement of the sun with terrifying precision, suggested a level of astronomical knowledge that rivaled the best observatories in the East. However, the most striking aspect of Opaline was its philosophy of the long view. The citizens didn't measure their lives in days or months, but in the growth of the slow-moving desert plants and the gradual erosion of the canyon walls. They were a people who had intentionally slowed their heartbeats to match the rhythm of the earth. When Thorne eventually left, he promised to keep their location a secret, realizing that the noise of the 1890s would destroy the very essence of their peace.
His maps were lost in a convenient fire at the Department of the Interior, and Opaline slipped back into the shimmering heat of the desert, a ghost city that chose to remain a ghost. While the canyons of the West hid philosophers, the bustling ports of the East were witnessing the birth of the great atmospheric experiment. As cities grew taller, the air above them became a new territory to be conquered. In 1894, a group of scientists in Boston began experimenting with sky stations, massive tethered box kites equipped with meteorological instruments and eventually observer braves. These men would spend 24 hours a day suspended 1,000 feet above the city, recording the movements of the clouds and the subtle shifts in wind patterns. It was a lonely, ethereal existence. They spoke of seeing the world as a living map, where the smoke of the chimneys looked like slow-moving rivers, and the lights of the city at night resembled a fallen galaxy.
The journals of these sky observers are filled with a strange vertical poetry. One observer, Elias Pendergast, wrote about the songs of the wires, the hum of the tethering cables as they vibrated in the high-altitude winds. He claimed that at a certain altitude, the sounds of the city blended into a single low-frequency note that felt like the breath of civilization. These experiments were the quiet precursors to the age of flight, but they were also a form of meditation. Suspended between the earth and the stars, these men experienced a perspective of America that no one else had ever known. They were the first to see the heat islands of the growing metropolises and the way the weather patterns began to change as the coal-fired factories pumped their soot into the sky. As the decade drew to a close, the focus of the American mystery shifted once more, this time to the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1897, a series of ghost lights began to appear over the ridges of North Carolina. Unlike the desert mirages or the salted diamonds of the past, these were physical phenomena witnessed by thousands. The brown mountain lights, as they came to be known, defied every scientific explanation of the time. They were described as glowing orbs of multicolored light that would rise from the valley floors, hover for a moment as if observing the onlookers, and then vanish into the mist. Government geologists were dispatched to investigate, theorizing that the lights were marsh gas or phosphorescent minerals. But the local communities who had lived in those mountains for generations had a different interpretation. They saw the lights as the embers of history, the spirits of the land itself reacting to the encroachment of the logging companies and the scarring of the hills. The lights became a symbol of the untamable nature of the American wilderness. No matter how many railroads were built or how many forests were cleared, there were still things in the old mountains that could not be measured by a yardstick or bought by a banknote. The mystery of the lights persists to this day, a flickering reminder that the earth has its own internal electricity, a history that is written in light rather than ink. By 1899, as the 19th century prepared to hand the world over to the 20th, a sense of the great hushing fell over the country. There was a collective realization that the era of the wild, unknown frontier was ending. The census of 1890 had already declared the frontier closed, but the soul of the nation was still catching up. This was the year of the midnight assemblies, gatherings in small towns across the Midwest where people would meet in silence to watch the last sunset of the century. They weren't celebrating, they were reflecting.
They thought of the gold rushes, the diamond hoaxes, the lost colonies in the woods, and the lonely lighthouses. They were mourning the loss of the mystery, even as they welcomed the convenience of the coming age. The boring history of 1899 is found in the local newspapers' weather reports and the ledgers of general stores, which recorded a sudden spike in the sales of journals and diaries. It seemed as though everyone in America suddenly felt the need to record their existence before the clock struck 12 and the old world disappeared forever. They wrote about the price of eggs, the thickness of the winter ice, and the way the wind felt on the last day of December. These mundane details are the true history for sleep, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a nation transitioning from the candlelight of the past to the neon glow of the future.
The turn of the century brought with it a strange, quiet tension, a bridge between the gaslit secrets of the Victorian era and the humming electric machinery of the New World. As the year 1900 dawned, the American obsession with the physical frontier began to turn inward toward the mysteries of time and the preservation of the mundane. This was the year of the Great Time Capsules, a phenomenon where ordinary citizens in small towns from Vermont to California became obsessed with the idea of being remembered. They didn't bury gold or diamonds, they buried the artifacts of their daily silence. In a small town in Ohio, a local librarian orchestrated a project where every resident contributed one item that defined their boring life: a worn-out thimble, a recipe for apple butter, a dried wildflower, and a single unposted letter to a future stranger. These capsules were not meant to be opened for 100 years, creating a silent underground network of history that ran parallel to the loud progress of the industrial age. It was as if the nation, sensing the rapid acceleration of life, was trying to anchor itself to the earth. At the same time, in the high deserts of New Mexico, a new kind of diamond hoax was emerging, but this one was unintentional. It was the discovery of the glass sands. In certain remote basins, the sand was so rich in silica and had been polished so perfectly by the wind that under a full moon, the entire desert floor appeared to be a sea of liquid silver. Travelers would stumble upon these basins and believe they had found a literal kingdom of light, only to find that the treasure was nothing more than common grit, refined by the patience of time. This period also saw the rise of the Registry of Quiet Places. In 1902, a group of naturalists began a project to map the areas of the United States where the sound of a steam whistle or a factory hum could not be heard. They traveled deep into the Okefenokee Swamp and the high canyons of the Sierras, measuring silence with the same precision that miners once measured ore. Their journals are masterpieces of sensory detail. They described the texture of silence in a cedar grove versus the silence of a salt flat. They found that in the deepest parts of the Maine woods, the silence had a weight to it, a physical presence that slowed the heart rate and cleared the mind. This registry was a silent protest against the encroaching noise of the 20th century, a map for the soul to follow when the world became too loud. While the naturalists sought silence in the woods, the city of New York was witnessing the strange life of the subterranean watchman. As the first subways were being carved into the bedrock of Manhattan,
a group of men was hired to live and work in the deep tunnels beneath the city. These men, known as sandhogs of a different sort, spent weeks in the cool, damp darkness beneath the city. They spoke of finding pockets of ancient air, cavities in the rock that had been sealed for millions of years. When breached, the air supposedly smelled of nothing, a vacuum of scent that made their heads light. They found fossilized shells and strange mineralized roots hundreds of feet from the frantic pace of Wall Street, a reminder that the city was merely a temporary lair on a very old planet.
One particular watchman, a man named Arthur Penhaligon, became a minor legend for his collection of city sounds from below. He claimed that if you pressed your ear to the schist at 3 o'clock in the morning, you could hear the city settling, a series of rhythmic groans and clicks as the weight of the buildings shifted on the bedrock. To him, the city was a living, breathing organism, and the subway tunnels were its veins. His life was a study in subterranean peace, a history of the city that ignored the lights and the people, focusing instead on the cold, steady heart of the stone. His records, kept in meticulous shorthand, offer a boring history of New York that is entirely vertical, a descent through time that ends in the silent, dark foundations of the world. By 1905, the American landscape was being transformed by the great reforestation of the mind. As the last of the old-growth forests in the East were being cut, a movement began to preserve not just the trees, but the experience of the woods. This led to the creation of the first intentional quiet parks, where visitors were forbidden from speaking above a whisper. The history of these parks is a narrative of people learning how to be still again. In a world of moving pictures and phonographs, the act of sitting under a tree for 6 hours became a radical form of therapy. The park rangers of the era were more like monks than lawmen, guiding people through the lessons of the leaf, teaching them to observe the way light filtered through the canopy and how the moss grew in patterns that mirrored the stars. The mid-1900s also brought the Obsidian Travelers, groups of amateur archaeologists who spent their summers tracking the ancient trade routes of the indigenous peoples of the Southwest. They weren't looking for ruins or pottery. They were looking for traveler's breath. They believed that certain narrow canyons held the echoes of the thousands of people who had passed through them over the centuries. They would set up sensitive diaphragms made of thin parchment and listen to the wind, claiming to hear the rhythmic thud of walking sticks and the soft murmur of ancient conversations. While scientifically dubious, their passion highlighted a deep American desire to connect with a history that predated the arrival of the Europeans, a longing for a sense of permanence in a country that was changing almost every week. As we move towards 1908, we encounter the story of the Great Cloud Census. In an effort to understand the changing climate of the Great Plains, the government commissioned hundreds of farm wives to keep daily cloud journals. For 5 years, these women looked at the sky every hour on the hour, sketching the shapes and recording the colors of the atmosphere. The result was a massive, decentralized archive of the American sky. These journals are deeply moving. Between technical descriptions of cirrus and cumulus clouds, the women wrote about the silence of the kitchen, the taste of the first frost, and the way the shadows of the clouds looked like phantom ships sailing over the wheat fields. It was a history of the heavens written by the people of the earth, a testament to the beauty of a life lived in observation of the mundane.
The transition into the second decade of the 20th century was marked by a peculiar phenomenon known as the Great Synchronization. As the railroads and the newly emerging telephone lines stretched their copper nerves across the American landscape, the nation began to pulse to a single, unified heartbeat. Before this, every town had lived by its own sun time, a clock set by the local noon. But now time was becoming a commodity, a rigid structure imposed upon the fluid reality of the frontier. Yet in the pockets of the country where the wires had not yet reached, a different kind of history was being written, a history of the unplugged and the unseen. In the year 1912, a strange project was initiated by a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, a researcher who was obsessed with the concept of residual memory. He traveled to the abandoned mining camps of the Sierras, the very places that had birthed the dreams of men like Philip Arnold 40 years earlier. Finch wasn't looking for gold or diamonds. He was looking for the aura of effort. He believed that places where humans had exerted tremendous physical and emotional energy left a permanent mark on the atmosphere. Using early phonographs and sensitive barometers, he attempted to record the weight of the past. His journals describe the eerie sensation of standing in a ghost town where the air felt heavy with the echoes of unfulfilled ambition. He spent nights in the middle of empty saloons, listening to the wood expand and contract, claiming that the structures were rehearsing the sounds of the crowds they once held. This was also the era of the invisible gardeners. In the rural South, particularly in the Appalachian foothills, a tradition emerged among the women of the small farming communities. They began to cultivate night gardens, patches of land filled only with flowers that bloomed in the moonlight or released their scent after the sun had set. These gardens were never meant for public display. They were private sanctuaries of scent and shadow. The boring history of these gardens is found in the seed catalogs and handwritten notes passed from mother to daughter. They talked about the moonflower and the evening primrose as if they were living deities. To a weary traveler passing through on a humid July night, the air would suddenly become thick with an overwhelming, ghostly perfume, a sensory map that guided them through the darkness without the need for a single lantern. As 1914 approached, the world across the ocean was preparing for a great and terrible conflict. But in the heart of the American Midwest, the focus remained on the Great Soil Study. Thousands of school teachers were asked to participate in a national project to document the various colors of the American earth. From the red clay of Georgia to the black loam of Iowa and the pale sands of the Nebraska Panhandle, a massive mosaic of soil samples was collected. This project was a testament to the grounding of the American spirit. While the rest of the world looked towards the sky and the machines of war, these citizens were looking down at the very foundation of their existence. The history for sleep in these records is found in the descriptions of the textures, the way the Iowa soil felt like crushed velvet, and how the Georgia clay turned into smooth red marble after a summer rain. In the coastal regions of the Pacific Northwest, the 1910s saw the rise of the fog listeners. These were men and women stationed at the edges of the Great Capes, tasked with identifying the distinct sounds of different types of fog. They claimed that a sea fog, heavy with salt and moisture, sounded muted and thick, while a mountain fog rolling down from the Cascades had a sharp, whistling edge. They developed a vocabulary of silence
that has since been lost to time. Their logs are masterpieces of auditory observation, recording the way a distant buoy would sound like a mournful bell in a cathedral of water, or how the wing beats of a passing gull would slice through the mist like a knife through silk. These individuals lived on the periphery of the world, serving as the ears of a nation that was increasingly blinded by its own progress. By 1916, the electrical fever had reached even the most remote farmsteads, but it brought with it a strange new aid, the hum. People who had lived their entire lives in the deep silence of the prairies began to report a low-frequency vibration that they couldn't explain. They believed it was the sound of the earth resisting the wires. This led to a brief but fascinating period of acoustic architecture, where farmers built their houses with resonance chambers, small hollow spaces in the walls filled with wool or sand to dampen the sound of the modern world. The history of these houses is a story of human adaptation, of people trying to preserve the old quiet within the shell of the new noise. It shows a deep instinctive understanding that once the silence is broken, it can never truly be mended. The late 1910s also saw the great migration of the birds becoming a matter of national obsession. With the invention of more portable cameras, amateur naturalists across the country began to document the flyways with unprecedented detail. But they weren't just counting birds, they were mapping the rhythms of the sky. They noticed that the birds didn't just fly, they followed invisible rivers of air that had existed for millions of years. This realization shifted the American perspective once again. We weren't just a nation of borders and states, we were part of a global biological pulse. The boring history of this movement is found in the blurred black and white photographs of 1,000 starlings over a Kansas cornfield, a visual representation of a collective, instinctive intelligence that defied the individualistic greed of the past. As we move towards the end of the decade, the year 1919 stands as a sentinel. The war was over, and the world was changing faster than anyone could keep up with. But in the quiet corners of the American library, a new project was beginning, the encyclopedia of every small thing. It was an attempt by a group of scholars to document the history of objects that were so common they were invisible. The safety pin, the wooden match, the glass canning jar. They realized that the true history of a people isn't found in the speeches of presidents, but in the tools they use to hold their lives together. This project, which spanned decades, is the ultimate sleep story, a slow, methodical journey through the mundane, reminding us that every object we touch has a lineage of thought and labor behind it.
The 1920s are often remembered for their roar, the clatter of the assembly line, the blare of jazz, and the frantic pace of the stock market. But beneath that surface of gold and chrome, a counter-quiet movement was taking hold in the American heartland. While the cities looked towards the future, the rural landscape became a sanctuary for the preservation of the slow. In 1922, a phenomenon known as the Great Porch Sitting was documented by sociologists in the Midwest. In towns across Indiana and Iowa, the act of sitting on one's porch for 3 hours every evening became an unofficial civic duty. It was a form of communal meditation where neighbors didn't necessarily talk, but simply existed together in the fading light, watching the fireflies and the slow movement of the constellations. The journals of these watchers provide a rhythmic history of the American evening. They recorded the exact minute the first cricket began its song, and the way the smell of the rain would travel miles across the flat plains before the first drop ever touched the dust. This was a time when people still knew the names of the winds. They could distinguish between the dry norther that brought the scent of pine from the distant hills and the wet southerly that carried the humid breath of the Gulf. This sensory literacy was a deep, unwritten history of the continent, a knowledge passed down not through books, but through the simple act of being still. It was the ultimate defiance of the roaring 20s, a refusal to be hurried by the ticking of a mechanical clock. In the year 1924, a strange discovery was made in the depths of the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. Explorers found a chamber that was perfectly silent and perpetually dry, containing a series of sand paintings created by the dripping of mineral-rich water over thousands of years. These weren't made by human hands, yet they resembled intricate maps of cities that didn't exist. The boring history of this discovery is found in the geological logs, which describe the breadth of the cave, the way the entire underground system would inhale and exhale as the atmospheric pressure changed on the surface. To the men who spent their days in these dark, silent cathedrals, the cave was a living entity, a history book written in calcium and time. They spoke of the voice of the stone, a low-frequency hum that could only be heard if one remained motionless for several hours.
This period also saw the rise of the great map of the night. As electric streetlights began to erase the stars from the urban skies, a group of amateur astronomers began a project to document the last dark places. They traveled to the high mesas of Utah and the remote reaches of the Maine coastline, sketching the Milky Way with a precision that modern cameras still struggled to capture. They didn't just map the stars, they mapped the texture of the darkness. They wrote about velvet nights, where the sky felt close enough to touch, and crystalline nights, where the stars seemed to vibrate with a cold blue energy. This project was a testament to the American longing for the infinite, a reminder that even as we built our steel canyons, we were still floating in a vast, mysterious ocean of light. As 1927 arrived, the world's attention was captured by Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. But in the quiet valleys of Vermont, a man named Wilson Bentley was finishing his life's work, the photography of snowflakes. Bentley, a simple farmer, had spent 40 years catching individual snow crystals on black velvet and photographing them through a microscope. He captured over 5,000 images, proving that no two were ever exactly alike. His work is the quintessential history for sleep, a repetitive, obsessive, and deeply beautiful study of the temporary. He didn't care about the fame of the flyers or the wealth of the bankers. He cared about the geometry of the cold. His life teaches us that the greatest wonders of the world are often the smallest and the most fleeting, requiring only patience and a steady hand to uncover. The late 1920s also witnessed the great archive of the loom. In the textile mills of New England and the weaving sheds of the South, workers began to keep small fabric diaries.
They would save a scrap of every cloth they produced, noting the humidity of the air that day and the specific tension of the threads. These archives are a tactile history of American labor, a record of the millions of miles of cotton and wool that clothed the nation. To touch these samples is to feel the heartbeat of a generation. They talk of the rhythm of the shuttle and the way the dust from the looms would dance in the shafts of afternoon sunlight. It was a world of repetitive motion and quiet focus, where the history of a person's life was woven into the very fabric of the things they made. As we move toward the final year of the decade, 1929, a sense of the great waiting began to settle over the country. The frantic energy of the decade was beginning to exhaust itself. In the quiet libraries of the West, a new movement was forming, the League of the Unhurried. Members pledged to perform at least one task a day at half speed, whether it was walking to the mailbox, drinking a cup of tea, or writing a letter. They believed that by intentionally slowing down, they could catch the echoes of the past that were being drowned out by the noise of the modern world. Their records are a fascinating study in mindfulness, documenting the hidden details of the world that only become visible when we stop rushing, the way a spider spins its web in a doorway, or the intricate patterns of rust on a garden gate. The boring history of 1929 is not the story of the stock market crash, but the story of the millions of people who were already living lives of quiet, steady endurance. It is the story of the farmers who were planting their winter wheat, the librarians who were cataloging the dreams of their communities, and the watchers who were still sitting on their porches looking at the stars. It is a history of the permanent things, the soil, the weather, and the human spirit, which remain unchanged even when the empires of finance crumble. This is the foundation of the American story, a quiet, unbreakable rhythm that carries us through the noise of the day and into the silence of the night.
The 1930s began with a heavy, dust-laden sigh. The great waiting of the previous year transformed into the great stillness. While the economic machinery of the cities ground to a halt, the American heartland faced a challenge that was both biblical and deeply atmospheric: the Dust Bowl. This was a time when the very earth seemed to take flight, turning the noon sky into a bruised purple, and then a total, suffocating black. Yet within this period of hardship, the history for sleep found its most profound chapter in the journals of the storm shelters. Families would huddle in underground cellars, listening to the abrasive whistle of the wind as it reshaped the geography of their lives. In that darkness, they didn't speak of loss. They spoke of the texture of the silence that followed a storm, a peace so absolute it felt like the world had been reset to its first day. One of the most remarkable figures of this era was a woman named Martha Eldridge, a weather observer in the panhandle of Oklahoma. For 7 years, Martha kept a record of the weight of the dust. She would collect samples of the silt that seeped through the cracks of her windows and analyze it under a magnifying glass. She found that the dust wasn't just dirt, it was a traveling history of the continent. One day she would find microscopic traces of the red clay from a neighbor's farm, and the next she would find a grain of sand that had traveled all the way from the foothills of the Rockies. Her life was a study in patience,
a quiet insistence that even in the midst of chaos, there was an order to be found. She wrote about the songs of the dry earth, the rhythmic clicking of the grasshoppers that seemed to be the only clock left in a timeless land. As the 1930s progressed, the American government began the Federal Writers Project, which sent thousands of people into the backwoods and small towns to record the life stories of ordinary citizens. This was the ultimate archival effort of the Gilded Age's descendants. They collected recipes for dandelion wine, the intricate rules of marbles played in dirt alleys, and the lullabies that had been whispered in the cabins of the Ozarks for 200 years. This project was the final great collection, an attempt to capture the soul of the nation before the radio and the television could homogenize it.
These records are a vast, slow-moving river of memory, a history of the unimportant that reminds us that every life is a masterpiece of small moments and quiet endurances. In the final years of this long journey, we find a strange echo of where we began, the Great Diamond Hoax. In 1938, a retired geologist named Harold Finch decided to make one last trip to the Uinta Mountains, to the very spot where Philip Arnold and John Slack had scattered their salted gems 66 years earlier. He didn't go there to find diamonds. He went to see how the earth had healed. He found that the diamond fields were now covered in a lush carpet of alpine wildflowers and resilient sagebrush. The holes the miners had dug were gone, filled in by the patient work of the wind and the snow. The earth had reclaimed its secrets. Finch wrote in his final diary entry that the greatest trick the earth ever played was not the diamonds, but the way it can make a lie disappear under a layer of moss. This realization brings our long story to a close. We have traveled from the glittering, deceptive streets of 1872 San Francisco, through the silent winters of the plains, into the secret canyons of the West, and finally into the quiet shelters of the 1930s. We have seen that the true history of America isn't found in the headlines of the papers or the ledgers of the banks, but in the boring history, the way the light hits a lighthouse in Maine, the sound of a porch swing in Indiana, and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a nation that knows how to wait. It is a history written in the mundane, a story of a people who have learned that the most valuable thing one can own is not a bag of diamonds, but a moment of absolute peace. As the sun sets on this century of stories, we are reminded of the great synchronization once more. But this time, it is not the synchronization of the clock or the wire, but the synchronization of the breath. In the deep, cool darkness of the American night, from the rugged coast of the Pacific to the salt-sprayed rocks of the Atlantic, the land is finally still. The winds have died down, the dust has settled, and the ghosts of the old pioneers have found their rest. The stories of the hoaxers and the scientists, the recluses and the watchers, all blend into a single low-frequency hum, the sound of a continent at sleep. The legacy of the Great Diamond Hoax remains not as a crime, but as a parable of human nature. It reminds us that we see what we want to see, but the earth only shows us what is true. And what is true is the silence, the slow growth of the trees, and the steady movement of the stars.
This is the history that matters. This is the history that endures. And as you drift into the quiet embrace of the night, you carry these stories with you, not as a burden of facts, but as a gentle rhythm, a soft light in the window of the past, guiding you toward a deep and restorative rest.